He's a maid in heaven. He's a knight on the tiles of...
Welcome everyone to this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. My name's Barney Hoskyns. I'm seated here with the Roly Birkin of rock journalism, Mr. Mark Pringle.
Hello, Barney.
Hello, Mark. Last week, when we taped this, we were slightly too late, sadly, to record the passing of the great Pete Shelley. So we just want to give him some props now. We did run a free audio interview with Pete last week, and I hope some of you were able to hear that. Buzzcocks, Mark.
I was very, very fond of the Buzzcocks. They were kind of called a punk band. They were one of the first punk bands, inverted commas, in this country. But there's something very unpunkish about them. For a start, they wrote really pretty songs. And they delivered them. I mean, he sang in this very nicely, sort of slightly offhand manner. There's no shouting at the audience. There's no barking. It lacked all the punk gestures.
Yes.
And of course, the second thing is they virtually invented DIY. I mean, critical to the growth of the independent record movement. Spiral Scratch EP, doing it themselves. They were the very first people to do that. Very, very important moment. And I lost my copy. I had it. It's gone.
Oh, yes. And of course, that was before Howard Devoto left to form Magazine.
The absolutely impossibly tedious Magazine. But yeah, I think we're all very fond of Pete Shelley.
Yeah.
It's very sad. You know, it obviously... he's a complicated guy. He has struggled with sexuality, all kinds of stuff. And again, one of the things his songs contained, they contained this humanity in the way in which he described personal politics, sexuality, and so on and so forth. And he had settled down with his partner in Estonia. He seemed a pretty happy guy. Heart attack.
Yeah. Kind of quintessentially provincial English voice, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Pop punk original.
He also put on the Lesser Free Trade Hall show that the Pistols played in Manchester, which was a very critical part of spreading the London punk message. And all the people who went to that show went on to form bands, or so it appears. So, yeah, important guy.
So, farewell Pete Shelley.
Yeah.
And we're now going to move on to everything that's new on Rock's Back Pages this week, starting with the week's audio interview, which is from February 1978, and it's with Bill Nelson of Be-Bop Deluxe. Tell us about the opening segment.
Yeah, it's the classic starting bands at school story, the delightfully named Cosmonauts, and it's in a way it's the story of every musician who's ever existed. It's discovering the guitar, forming a band at school, playing kind of the occasional youth club thing, and it's just a sweet little story of that sort.
When I first started, I was at secondary school, a place called Ings Road Secondary Modern School, and I'd been playing an acoustic guitar purely accidentally, one that my father had bought me after seeing me mess about with my brother's toy one. And I met a friend at school called Ian Parkin, who, strangely enough, ended up in the original lineup of Be-Bop. He was in the same class and everything, and we were about the same level of competency on guitar. And we put a little band together, him and I, and a friend who had drums made from biscuit tins with brown paper stretched over them. And I think we had two girl singers and somebody else singing vocals. And we called ourselves the Cosmonauts at the time. And we had little cards printed that said the Cosmonauts Rhythm and Beat Vocal Group or something like this, available for bookings.
Did you get money?
No, not really. We did a couple of youth clubs and we were paid in bottles of pop and ice cream, I think.
So that was Bill Nelson talking about his very earliest musical days in the Cosmonauts, playing for Soda Pop. I love it. I mean, he comes across really well in this interview. Be-Bop Deluxe are still going for another year or so.
No, this is actually kind of the really interesting thing, is he's talking very positively about the band and about how to change direction. They'd broken up within about 6 months of this
6
interview.
months, was it?
The Drastic Plastic was their last album, which was their attempt to deal with punk, to all intents and purposes. You know, a much more stripped down, much simpler sound. Because, in a sense, Be-Bop Deluxe were sort of like an amalgam of what Queen and
glam and prog.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean they were one of the bands which were really hit by punk. I mean, there's a whole raft of bands suddenly found it really difficult to get gigs, to tour, and so on and so forth. 78 saw an enormous winnowing of the sort of, let's say, the second division university / small hall sort of level bands, of which they were sort of pretty much part of. So it's curious, this is a man talking enormously optimistically about the future of his band, and within months they were gone. So.
I mean, Be-Bop Deluxe. By the way, the reason we're talking about Be-Bop Deluxe and Bill Nelson right now is that he turns 70 next week, so we thought we would mark the occasion.
Happy birthday!
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have many of their records. I did buy the single "Made in Heaven" in 1975. That seemed to me a wonderfully different kind of record at that point. I mean, 1975 being in many ways such a sort of dreary and bloated year. And Be-Bop was sort of like somewhere between kind of glam and punk. That song I think is terrific, from the Futurama album, produced by Roy Thomas Baker, of course, who'd produced Queen. I think it was EMI/Harvard's idea to bring Roy Thomas Baker in. And in the audio, Bill says he didn't particularly enjoy working with him.
We'll probably play that clip later, but it is very, very amusing. The other thing is, he was very much kind of a local Wakefield boy, and forming a band with sort of essentially local musicians who weren't really up to playing the sort of stuff that he wanted to do, and having the record company initially wanting to sign him as a solo artist, and him saying, "I want my band with me," but then he effectively sacked virtually all of the band within a space of about a year, and had replaced them. So it's curious. He does say he sounds like he's got a sort of curious sort of self-doubt running through him, and I think he felt his provincialism very, very hard. And actually, I think he found the music business difficult. I think he felt like a bit like a fish out of water there.
I mean, he's an interesting character. He didn't sort of fit into any real category, did he? I mean, they sort of tasted a little bit of commercial success with Ships in the Night. They were on Top of the Pops, they were on the Old Grey Whistle Test, but they weren't glam, they weren't prog, they were somewhere in between. They were certainly different from all the kind of long-haired denim bands of the era.
It's worth pointing out that he went to art school, and he, as a lot of English musicians have, and he brought to the process some sort of like half-formed ideas he'd gathered while at art school, and so the way in which he'd manipulate image and so on and so forth. He started off looking a bit like a Bowie clone, and then cut his hair off and started wearing suits and so on and so forth. He talks in the interview about going to America and being on bills with like Blue Oyster Cult and Ted Nugent. The audience had been totally confused by the appearance of the band, but then they would launch into this extraordinarily complex and high-energy sort of instrumental-based sort of music. And he talks about blowing Ted Nugent off the stage.
The idea of them supporting Ted Nugent is brilliant. But they were slightly ahead of the curve, weren't they? He talks about the decision they made to wear suits and look like kind of bank clerks at a time when I mean, that was really ahead of, that was like almost 80s in Edinburgh, wasn't it? But I think he was a really talented guy. I mean, interesting songs, interesting kind of space-age themes, and a lot of kind of 70s tropes.
I have to admit, I'm not sure I consciously listened to them once in my entire life. They kind of just so weren't what I was interested in. But it is a very interesting interview, actually. It's well worth listening to.
It really is. And we're going to turn our attention to the free offerings on the RBP homepage, starting with something very different from Be-Bop Deluxe, which is Wu-Tang Clan. The reason I chose this as the main feature for this week is that there's a very interesting book just came out, published by Granta, of all companies, about the Wu-Tang Clan by a guy called Will Ashon, who went to Balliol College, Oxford.
That's a natural fit, isn't it?
It's an unusual take, not just on Wu-Tang, but on hip-hop, the sort of tributaries that fed into hip-hop. I'm not sitting here pretending I've read it cover to cover, but I've dipped into it. It's very, it's very literate, it's very smart and interesting. And it sort of begs the question in a way, why have Wu-Tang got this special reputation in the hip-hop sort of firmament?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, sonically, they were fabulous. I mean, they were doing stuff just purely with sound, which is really something else. Secondly, they were above and outside of the then-current East Coast-West Coast beef stuff. They were nothing to do with gangster as such, even though there were elements of gangsterism about some of their approach. They also kind of more or less invented the collective. In this country, So Solid Crew, an example of some people who looked at Wu-Tang, thought that's how you do it, So there was no single focus on an individual. I mean, Giza, RZA, and so on. There are people who sort of do stand out. But I think this thing about being above the fray of the East Coast, West Coast stuff happening in precisely that time, this is not, 93, 94, 95 stuff, allowed people to accept them without it carrying any sort of other baggage with it.
Yeah. And you talk about the collective, the ensemble. I mean, there were 9 main guys, but even outside of that, there were all kinds of other hangers-on and contributors.
They were from Staten Island. Staten Island is a part of New York, but it isn't. So again, I think that gave them sort of slightly
some distance,
and their fascination with the sort of kind of comic /
kung fu
culture, all of that sort of stuff.
I mean, I love them. Sonically, it's really where it got me. RZA being the main guy. Yeah. One of the 3 pieces that we're featuring is the excellent R.J. Smith interviewing them for Spin in 1997, and he makes the point that RZA really is the boss. There's a very chaotic bunch of guys, but when he steps in and barks orders, they fall into line.
Equally, when he steps out, which he does do from time to time, the whole thing tends to sort of slightly come unraveled. Yeah,
but he's so. I mean, I don't think I'd ever heard anything like Wu-Tang. Particularly, I mean, I loved the first album, but there's these really interesting kind of Southern soul samples that he uses later on. Almost like his sensibility is almost lo-fi. It really gets away from the kind of very big, brash, I'm not going to say slick, but, hip-hop had never sounded quite like this before. It's all kind of fragmented and broken and weird and dissonant.
I mean, my only criticism, really, of their first 2 or 3 albums is they're too long. They weren't very good at editing themselves.
No.
But they're sensational to listen to. Even if you don't really listen to the words. I'm not a great word person. Songs can go past and I'll know like one line from them. And the same with raps and hip hop. But just as you say, his production, his ability to assemble different things from different sources, and to create an extraordinary atmospheric sort of soundscape for them to work on.
Always quite creepy and menacing in many ways, but sometimes very beautiful, very moving. The sense of menace around Wu-Tang is conveyed in some of these pieces. The very first piece is Angus Beattie, one of the best British writers on hip-hop, encountering them in London in 1994, so about, a few months after the release of Enter the 36 Chambers. And there's already just this sort of chaos and anger and imminent sort of violence in the air.
We ran a couple of weeks ago Simon Price live review from that when they were over on that particular tour, and he actually interviewed them. I haven't found the interview. I asked Simon, and he was basically sort of was kind of held prisoner on a tour bus and given a really hard time by them. It was in this kind of cloud of weed smoke and paranoia. It was some experience. I mean, not to be too nationalistic about it, but actually the English pop press were very early on were fans of Wu-Tang in a way that most of the American press, really the white American music press, didn't get. And they came over here very early. I mean, this 94, 95 is
94, of course, the most extreme example of, shall we say, sort of chaos and violence in the Wu-Tang story is the sad story of Old Dirty.
Yeah.
So the last of the 3 pieces in this feature is William Shaw visiting Old Dirty Bastard in the Clinton Correctional facility up near the Canadian border in upstate
Yep.
New York. And just what a sad portrait
Yes.
this is. This is 2002. He died 2 years later. And fascinating, endearing, rather charming, but absolutely insane guy.
Yeah.
There's an amazing track of his on one of his solo albums called I Can't Wait, which I think is one of the great hip-hop tracks, and I'm not making, huge claims for the rest of his solo ever, but there are amazing things he did, and obviously he started to fade out of the Wu-Tang picture because it's just
he probably was
hopeless.
clinically insane. I
think he probably was.
And being part of the posse supported him up to a point, but you can only go so far.
The week's featured writer in the Almost Famous section is Mr. Tim Cooper, who recently came aboard the Rock's Back Pages Express, and 3 pieces from the last almost 20 years, actually, including an interview with none other than David Bowie in New York in 2002, talking about what a kind of clean living, fine, upstanding gentleman David has become. Also asking him about the new album Heathen. I remember, Mark, when we were the very early days of Rock's Back Pages. I remember this album came out. I think I had to write something about Bowie for The Independent, and so I really had to listen to that new album, Heathen.
Yeah.
And I came to the conclusion it was a really good record.
I think it was the first of what became a run of stuff that Bowie did right up to his death, where he's actually writing about his age and about being an adult and about being a grown-up. And which is very hard subject for any pop musician or erstwhile pop musician to sort of do. And we listened to that quite a lot in the office, and it was thought, this is really pretty good. His last 4 albums, I'd say, had a real emotional core to them. I think they did. And were intensely personal in a way that so much of his output wasn't.
There was a deep sort of melancholia in this record, while it was still very strong, kind of rhythmically in arrangement. It was Bowie going back to kind of basics with Tony Visconti.
Yes.
I think it was almost done in Tony's sort of home studio in Westchester County, and it had a kind of it did feel personal after his adventures in sort of drum and bass and things like that.
Tin Machine, and
exactly.
It's like
this is actually Bowie kind of doing what he should be doing, writing songs about what it means to be. Well, David Bowie, to be human. And so the other 2 pieces by Tim are a piece about Beach House, the dream pop duo from Baltimore, who I really like. And their album this year, I think, has been one of... I don't think it's gone down particularly well in the Rock's Back Pages office, but I'm rather a fan of that sort of dark, blissed out, moody sort of sound, and I really like the new album.
You mean you could hear the sound of my teeth grinding across the room?
Well, I hear that a lot, obviously, but perhaps more than usual. But I'm a fan. Something I think anyone who's ever loved the likes of sort of Cocteau Twins, My Bloody Valentine, anyone who's a fan of that kind of oceanic style can only admire Beach House. The last of the pieces is an interview with Pete Townsend about an orchestral version of Quadrophenia.
Oh, God, my skin is crawling at the very thought of it.
You can probably hear Mark's skin crawling, so we'll let that speak for our reaction to... I don't know what really to say on that. Obviously, there are people who just think Townsend can do no wrong, and I did like Quadrophenia. I certainly wouldn't want to sit through an orchestral version of it. But that was kind of the last Who that I really liked. The album Moon and Entwistle are just phenomenal on Quadrophenia, I think. So that's what's free, and that leads us into what isn't free on Rock's Back Pages. By the way, we would like to thank all of you for listening to the Rock's Back Pages podcasts so far, and we would invite you to be so kind as to review and rate the podcast on iTunes. It would help us. If you've enjoyed it, please say so.
If you haven't enjoyed it, just keep your mouth shut.
That's Mark. That's not me. Mark now is going to tell us about some of the highlights.
Yeah. The very earliest piece from in itself isn't very interesting. It's a reader's letter to the Record Mirror from 1962, headlined "A Sinatra Fan Hits Back," or "The Sinatra Fans Hit Back." And it's written by son F.G. Dellar, secretary of the Frank Sinatra Appreciation Society. Fred Dellar is one of our writers. Barney, tell us something about Fred Dellar.
Oh, the lovely Fred Dellar. Universally adored, really, by anyone in the music journalism racket. Fred is now in his 80s, still writing for Mojo. I was reading Fred in the 70s.
Yeah.
He's just such an absolute sweetheart, such a fount of knowledge. Really, there's very little Fred doesn't know about the history of popular music. So when you stumbled on this, I was so delighted. And to learn that he was writing in the 50s, I actually sent him an email a couple of days ago with this letter, and he said he couldn't remember writing it, but it was almost certainly him.
Didn't he say he'd written his first thing about Sinatra in the 50s?
In the 50s, precisely. Yeah. So, Fred is just a joy and a delight. And I remember talking about Sinatra with Fred back when I was at NME in the 1980s.
It's one of the shames of my job is I really don't have enough time to read readers' letters, because actually a remarkable number of the writers have made their very first appearance in print, writing letters to the music press. Moving on to 68, Jim Payne, who we talked about briefly last week, didn't write nearly enough, because this guy could write like an absolute dream. And this is about Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. Jim had been hired to play drums, a pickup band for Hank Ballard visiting Florida in the late 60s. And as he says, in Daytona Beach, it rains every afternoon for half an hour or so. When Hank Ballard arrived, it was raining. It's hard to make a dignified entrance in the rain. Arriving in a Cadillac helped. The Midnighters' rather formal travelling duds helped too. For example, a cranberry bandolon knit shirt, lemon metallic slacks, contrasting see-through socks and patent leathers. The people standing around were impressed, which is great. And it's a wonderful, evocative description of a guy who's essentially very much down on his luck. His days of making hit records are over, where just 10 years before, he could have gone to Daytona Beach and packed the place out for top dollar. Now he's playing with a pickup band for $400.
There's great pathos there.
It's beautifully written. And, if Hank says, I've cut another record and maybe it'll be a hit, and you kind of know that he doesn't believe it himself. It's lovely.
Great.
Next piece from 69, Richard Croman, who went on to write for Los Angeles Times and many, many other publications. He started off on his student newspaper, the UCLA Daily Bruin, and it's about The Who and about their destroying their instruments thing. And it's a kind of marvellously pretentious piece in a way. I mean, he's writing to a sort of serious student audience, and he's comparing The Who to like autodestructive art and all this sort of stuff, So it's just great fun. It's just it's not fun. I mean, it's a proper essay, but it's a very interesting sort of take on stuff. 73, Melody Maker, Michael Watts, the very, very great Michael Watts, reviewing Diana Ross at the Albert Hall. This is a point where Diana Ross, obviously, a few years past being a Supreme, a few years ahead of developing her disco diva personality and working with Chic and so on and so forth. And at this point, she was basically turned into a sort of supper club entertainer. He says, only it was all a little too icky last week, and those who went to London's Albert Hall, ready, like me, to be idolatrous and fall beneath the spell, may have become, like me again, a touch bored when the superstar's infant progeny was born on stage and induced to sing along with Mama, while the latter threw Gardinis into the adoring front rows. It confirmed the initial feeling that her appeal is slightly more ornamental and cute than vocal, and that she has more in common with Shirley Bassey, say, than Billie Holiday. And I think that's a very good description of actually who Diana Ross was at that particular point, and a product of the Motown finishing school and so on and so forth. Another live review from 77, Little Feet at the Free Trade Hall, Manchester, by Paul Morley. Now, when we came across this, Barney and I both rolled with laughter, because we can't think of a less Little Feet fanish personality than Paul Morley.
Or a less Morley-esque act than Little Feet.
Well,
really.
Indeed. It turns out he absolutely loved them, but they weren't very good. And indeed, a friend of mine was working at the Hard Rock Cafe in London when they were on that tour in 77, and he found Lowell George standing in the street in tears saying, I can't go on with this. And he left, about a year later, I guess. So Paul Morley writes, the feat should be all about exhilaration, shouldn't they? The skill and sophistication of Little Feat, without any spontaneity, depth or force, is like not acceptable, or rather acceptable, which rock and roll should not be. Paul Morley's a very disappointed guy. He talks in the review about going home after the gig and putting on the wonderful bootleg Electric Lycanthrope, and saying, why weren't they like this?
Well, this is where I inevitably interject that I was one of the fortunate few who saw Little Feat play the Rainbow in London in 1975, when it was still a relatively happy camp.
Oh, yeah.
And they were absolutely sensational, and it's just worth remembering that. Yes, I was surprised that Morley even deigned to review Little Feat at a time when, of course, he was championing punk and everything that was happening in Manchester. There couldn't be a less sort of Howard Devoto-ish band, really, with Little Feat. But, no, Little Feat, I mean, I was 15 when I saw Little Feat, and I was sort of just getting into, what I call kind of facial hair music. We had a couple
had a lot of facial hair.
Well, there was a lot of facial hair, and headliners Doobie Brothers also had a lot of facial hair. We'd seen a couple of mates and I had been to see the Doobie Brothers at the Rainbow the previous year, and we sort of loved The Captain and Me. And but by January '75, Lowell George had effectively made the Doobie Brothers redundant. It really was true that we all went. There were lots of people there, and lots of people who claimed to have been there. It's one of those legendary gigs. But I know that Elvis Costello was there. Not that I sort of saw him or would have recognised him as Declan McManus, but it was a very important gig in terms of like pub rock and roots rock and everything, and they were absolutely sensational. And I seem to remember people just sort of leaving when the Doobie Brothers came on.
So
I mean, it was strange.
You can feel my envy crawling across the room at you. I'd love to have gone to that show, and I knew a few people who did. I loved Little Feat at the time. I mean, I listen to them still. Do I love them as much? Probably not. They did have structural weaknesses as a band in that respect.
And not that many great songs, actually, at the end of the day,
I think that's right.
But they were great.
Yeah.
And I know it's a cliche for old balding blokes to talk nostalgically about Little Feat, but they were, my God, they were funky. And Lowell George was an extraordinary guy.
We are
player and
old
singer.
Balding blokes.
Well, I'm more balding than you.
It's getting a bit thinner.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, can we get a shot?
Moving swiftly on. 1978, the wonderful Brian Case, who wrote about jazz to the NME, and I think was a lot of NME readers' gateway drug to jazz.
Absolutely.
I think Brian is absolutely one of my favourite writers. As an interviewer, he's just fantastic, and whether it's Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter. Anyway, this is an interview with Dexter Gordon, who at that point was just in the process of moving back to America from his long exile in Scandinavia. And Brian's great. He says, he was wearing a dressing gown, endless shanks, slippers, the kind of carriage and handsome, effortless royal style that 55 and a chapter in the Be-Bop history books can confer on a man. Fenya, Dex's pretty Scandinavian wife, had arrived that morning bearing gifts. Her, her, her! Dexter laughs. The man displaying a pair of plaid, long-legged underpants you could lag an oil rig with. I figure she bought these as a joke. They're, nice. Her, her. He drapes them over the front of his dressing gown and looks down at himself, vastly diverted. Well, when it starts getting like Scandinavia, you've got to put a little extra cover on, huh? It's just, it's fabulous.
He writes
stuff.
like one of the great sort of noir crime prose stylists, doesn't he?
Knowingly
Brian?
So.
I mean, completely. But he does it so well.
Does it brilliantly.
I saw him maybe 2-3 years ago. Jeff Barrett of Heavenly published a little book of Brian's writings. Beautiful little capsule portraits of people like Dexter Gordon.
Yeah.
And Richard Williams interviewed him at the Heavenly Social here in London, and it was a delight. And Brian read some of his stuff, and he was absolutely was one of the best.
Yes, I think it was sad that he went to Melody Maker, where I sort of feel that his talents weren't correctly utilised. That there's something about being the jazz man on the punk and post-punk Bible was the enemy at the time, which gave him a sort of freedom to sort of really do interesting stuff. And he was never quite the same writer on the Melody Maker, partly because the Melody Maker had a lot more jazz writers.
Well, Richard, who was the editor at that time, Richard Williams, the aforementioned, of course, was steeped in jazz.
Yes,
so
totally.
sort of, recognised Brian's strengths. But I understand what you're saying. But there was no one left at NME. There was no one at NME.
Richard Cook sort of took over the role.
Cook did take over, and I knew Richard well, and he was like, in a sense, the new Brian Case, although a very different kind of writer.
But I thought that Brian Case had a really good home at the NME at that time.
Indeed.
Moving to 82, Jeffrey Hyams in the Baltimore Sun interviewing Ricky Lee Jones, and it's very interesting because she's really talking about the Tom Waits, Chucky, Ricky Lee triumvirate of hard-drinking beatniks in Los Angeles, and about her withdrawal from that. She says, we did things that people don't do now or even think about too much, and that made us comrades. And that's fun for a while, but then it becomes shallow. And then she goes on to say, it's the people who sit around nearly destroying themselves that other people somehow look to as models. Part of it is voyeurism. I think that she's really describing how she could only go so far in that persona, only behave in that way so far before it would just eat her up.
Well, she would have died, I think, by all accounts. Ricky is someone who... that whole story of her and Tom and Chucky Lee, there's a great kind of beat romance quality to that. And her Pirates album, her second album, which I really think is one of the greatest records ever made, is really the sort of story of hanging out with those guys and the sort of, the mischief they got up to, the fun they had, but also the incredible pain for her of losing weight. And I also just wanted to note that you added a Laura Nero piece, and while she wouldn't talk to me for my Tom Waits book, she did very, very sweetly when I was writing a piece about Nero, and I figured she must have been influenced by Laura Nero.
Yeah.
She wrote a great screed of stuff about what Nero had meant to her. Yeah. And I incorporated some of that into the piece. And I think of them not, they're sort of in the same orbit. They're both these extraordinary women who take incredible risks with their music.
And also white women who mind areas of black music in a way that other singer-songwriters really didn't do certainly in the same sort of way. They both felt at home in the sort of clothes of sort of R&B.
They certainly did. And I mean, I remember having a Laura Nero album when I was at, I think I had New York Tenderberry, probably the age of like 16 or something, and it just wasn't ready for it. I didn't hear what was so brilliant about Nero till some years later. I think you sort of have to grow up a bit to engage with that level of emotional intensity, actually. But anyway, so Nero and Jones, I'm delighted to see both of them in the list.
The last one from me is from 96, is the Prodigy. Basically, the wonderful Simon Price goes on the road with the Prodigy. I have to say, they don't come out of it very nicely. For a start, the Liam Howlett is always kind of like going on about how they won't do Top of the Pops, because it's like not our light show and also, and how they won't be interviewed by smash hits. As if they're desperate for some sort of notion of credibility. And you know what? We love smash hits here at Rock's Back Pages. That you can take yourself far too seriously. He says, we don't do any teeny bopper press. I don't want to be associated with bands whose music is in magazines like that. Get a grip, mate. Get over yourself. And one or two other members of the band say some fairly reprehensible.
They're a pretty horrible bunch, I think.
Yeah, well,
really. Let's be honest.
I
mean, I think for a moment, I think they were very exciting and they were genuinely subversive and threatening. And the only time I ever wrote about them was to review The Fat of the Land for Rolling Stone, and I did think it was sort of sonically. Tremendously exciting music, but it kind of the flavour wore off after a while.
I have very strong memories of the Firestarter video, which sort of was one of the most jarring things I'd seen. In a sense, there was sort of an element of punk rock about them, which is good. But Simon Price on the road with them. I mean, Simon's a great writer, but I don't think I'd like to hang out with the Prodigy that much, really.
No
choice.
No, it'd be like hanging out with Killing Joke, which was the nastiest experience I ever had as a music writer. But we'll move on from that. So that's your lot.
That's my lot.
I just want to mention a couple of pieces, sort of slightly in kind of connection with the Be-Bop piece, the Bill Nelson audio. There's an amusing piece about New Prog by Mark Weingarten in the Los Angeles Times. He's essentially talking to the promoter of a festival called Prog West, Bob Rosenthal, and so they're talking about bands like Porcupine Tree, but other groups I'd never even heard of, including the splendidly named Magdalene of the Well. Magdalene of the Well. I mean, I've got to hear them, right? But I like the
Do you mind if I'm not in the room while you listen?
But Bob Rosenthal. So at one point they start talking about Radiohead, and because there was a lot of talk about Radiohead being new prog, was OK Computer was sort of prog in disguise, or some kind of neo Pink Floyd thing. And Rosenthal says, just once, I'd like to see a band like Radiohead come out and say, "Hi, we're prog," which to my knowledge is something Tom York has never done. But in many ways, some of the proggier elements in Radiohead are the things I actually do like about prog. I don't despise prog, but I've never heard Magdalene of the Well. The final piece I just wanted to note, because I know we are both huge fans of Bobby Blue Bland, is another Jeffrey Himes piece about Bobby Blue Bland and Americana. He makes the point that the ancestors of Americana are so often the usual suspects, the Hank Williamses and Woody Guthries and so forth. And an African-American performer like Bobby Bland isn't sort of cited in that bracket and should be. And he talks to a bunch of artists, loosely definable as Americana artists who all worship Bobby Blue Bland or cover Bobby Blue Bland, and it's just really interesting. I do think Bobby Bland was, apart from being just one of the greatest singers, I think he was a really important figure in the transition from kind of rhythm and blues into soul music. And I think we've talked about this in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, he had a unique voice. He's one of those voices that you hear the first word.
Huge, cavernous voice.
You know exactly who it is from the first word of the song. This thing about Americana is interesting because actually, what's notable about Bobby Bland as a blues artist, but particularly in that transitional period you're describing, is he had a very uptown sound. It is not lo-fi, rootsy, Americana sort of sound in that respect. This is a guy who used the best musicians he could, had lushly orchestrated albums with sort of, large bands and strings and all kinds of stuff like that. So, I mean, I'd say that Americana isn't the first word which comes to mind when I think of Bobby Blue Bland.
No, I take your point. Although I would actually say the stuff I love most in the Bobby Bland back catalogue is not the stuff with the big blaring horns. The slightly smaller productions, like Willie Mitchell did with him in Memphis. Right. Just like Two Steps from the Blues, that extraordinary album.
That's fantastic. Right?
I mean, his stuff was a bit. These albums weren't conceived as albums, so they don't necessarily have uniform kind of production or arrangement styles. But I don't like him in big band mode. I like him when the classic track is Stormy Monday Blues, and that is just. I mean, but I think he's probably my favourite singer.
Stormy Monday, I believe, was pretty much one take at the end of a session. Clyde Stubblefield was his drummer at the time, and when Clyde met Jabbo Starks in the process of joining James Brown band, Jabbo Starks said, "Who do you play? You're Clyde Stubblefield. You played with Bobby Bland." It was like, and then they proceed. There were 5 drummers in the James Brown band at that point. They proceeded to get rid of everyone else. They just drove them out one by one.
Well, there you go.
But Clyde Stubblefield, when interviewed, always talks enormously fondly about working with Bobby Bland. I mean, it was always an interesting musical experience. And he was at the top of his game at that time. Just a great singer.
Just a phenomenal singer. My push comes to shove, my favourite singer of all time, I think. And I was lucky enough to meet him once, lucky enough to see him perform once. He's gone now. I think he's up there with, Ray Charles, with Sam Cooke.
I think that partly due to the efforts of people like yourself over the years, his reputation has got to where it should be. I think that when I first started listening to Bobby Blue Bland, which would have been about in the mid-70s, I guess early mid-70s, he had sort of been bypassed. You know, B.B. King, who he had worked with, cut a couple of albums.
Of course.
Was the great B.B. King. Ray Charles was Ray Charles. And Bobby Bland was sort of almost seen as kind of a marginal figure. And I think that's no longer the case. I think there are so many people who have just fallen back in love with him.
Including Mick Hucknall, who we don't have the highest opinion of, but I have to say I was touched that he made a whole album called Tribute to Bobby. He was obsessed with Bobby Bland, and so it's always heartening when somebody gets that kind of recognition, whether it's posthumous or not. So that's our lot this week. Thanks for joining us. Listen in next week. Please, as I say, do rate and review on iTunes or elsewhere. And we're going to love you and leave you with some more of Bill Nelson talking, this time, Mark, about...
about Roy Thomas Baker. Very amusingly.
So this is Bill Nelson talking about working on the Futurama album with Queen producer Roy Thomas Baker.
And having the curtains in the studio set on fire.
Yes. Over and out. Bye.
Bye.
Take the rough with the smooth, a token of love, my love.
Futurama, Roy Thomas Baker, was that his choice, EMI's choice, or what?
That was EMI's choice at the time. They decided that we were going to, have Roy Thomas Baker as a producer.
Because he was hot at the time with Queen,
he'd just got Queen in the charts and everything, and it was like, this guy makes hits, so let's have him, And Roy's good. I like the man as a person, but I didn't enjoy working with him, to be honest. He's got a very formulated attitude. He tends to treat... I've spoken to other people that's worked with him. Nazareth is a band that's actually worked with him. And he does have a set way of recording, like the drums are recorded in a certain way and so on. And he's a very kind of... not happy-go-lucky. He's a bit crazy sometimes in the studio, like he sets curtains on fire while you're doing vocals.
Really?
Yeah, which can be fun if you're in the mood, but if you've been striving to get a vocal part right for a couple of hours, and some guy comes in and really sort of upsets you when you just think you're getting it right, it really caused a lot of frustration on my part, and I never wanted to work with him after that.
That was an excerpt from an Ian Ravendale interview with Bill Nelson of Be-Bop Deluxe, concluding this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. The presenters were Barney, Hoskyns and Mark Pringle, and the producer was Jasper Murison-Bowie. For show notes and a list of articles discussed, please visit rocksbackpages.com/podcast. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews, at rocksbackpages.com.